this is a good time to, maybe instead of reading a passage, I'm going to put some up there and I'm going to refer to them. Maura, I think, yep, she has them up there, and there might be a couple of more. They're short, but I'll tell you the stories more than anything else, and you can read the scripture on it later. In the book of Nehemiah, and it's a narrative, we're going to look at that in just a moment, and you could turn there if you want to. If you're using a Pew Bible, it's going to be in 683. But before that, one of the things that's really important is to understand every single time that God's people, that something amazing happened, it was always, the people working together. And when I say something amazing, that's not true. You'll find some things that are amazing that God just does. But when you see a movement, all the people coming together, it's very powerful. You find them from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament, and God continues to work that way, right? And so we're going to take a look a little bit about that. When everybody gets involved, if you've ever been a part of an organization where you look and say, it was an amazing place because everybody had their job, they loved what they were doing, they were working, they were upbeat about it, it was exciting. Most of our job situations are not that way. They're just not. You get the few people that are. But if you've ever been part of a movement of something, I'll give you an example of one that I had started by mistake, a ministry missions trip organization called Touch the World. It's still going on today. It's 30 years old now, I think, or older than that. So, we took a bunch of kids just to see if their lives would change to an Indian reserve. Their lives, did some work there. Their lives changed so much that two of them went into full-time ministry. One of them went into social work, which was not ministry, but did it for ministry reasons. And it was an amazing thing to watch. From that, the youth group had been 12 kids for about 4 months. I got there, it was 12 kids. More than that, about 4 months. And when I said, hey, what if we do a missions trip? And there's a whole God story behind that. I don't have time to tell you today. But within 2 weeks, I had 5 more kids that wanted to come. The youth group had met every week. Never another person. So we decided to do this. All these kids come, and we go to this Indian reserve. Their lives get changed. The next year we run 3 teams. They come back into their school. So now we had 19 kids, and they went back into school, and by December we had 60 kids because they were so on fire for what they saw God do. And when we got back, one of the kids that was the laziest of all the kids before we went, he was, by his own testimony, and one of the smartest, but lazy. And he said, can I help you put stuff away tomorrow? I said, well, I'm doing that at 6 a.m, so, you just got home. Now, we were getting up at 5:45 in the morning every day, but now you're home in his own bed, and I'm thinking, this kid ain't showing up, So he goes, no, I'll come down and help you. I said, okay, I'll be there either way. So I start working. He got there at like 6 o'clock, and it was amazing. So we're going back and forth, and we're taking stuff and putting it in the basement of where I lived, and it's on the church grounds. And I stopped him. I said, Paul, listen, I got to ask you a question. Just thought of this. You've just slept in your bed for the first night, so you're still fresh coming off the trip. Tell me your experience. And Paul was a very articulate kid who went to be an English major and then an English teacher. And he paused for a second, maybe 15 seconds, and he said, I was raised in this church. He said, I've heard about God every single day since I could remember. He said, this was the first time I experienced him. So we started using that. Come experience God, as one of our things. So, and we did. And the organization grew. We ended up incorporating in 5 different countries, 6 countries, and traveled all over. We took kids everywhere, building and so forth. Lots of life change. But the most amazing thing about the whole thing, we would train them for 6 days before we went. Everybody came, didn't matter what team you were going on, even if you were going to sleep indoors, in a church, in the basement of a church or whatever. We went to rough places, third world mostly. So, wherever you're going to sleep, everybody got trained the same way. They had to sleep in a tent. Their luggage could only be 50 pounds. That's all we allowed. And so kids would get there and we'd have scales. And we'd say, here, give it to mom, give it to mom, give it to, you don't need this, you don't need this, you don't need this, right? So they would come, and they had a tent, they had everything, so they learned everything, how to do all that stuff. They had KP duty, everything. It was just like a machine. By the time it was 10 years in, and even before that, we had to stop the volunteers. We had 100 people that we could use in a training session. So we'd have 300-400 people there, and 100 of them were volunteers. Those volunteers got broken out into groups. They had builders, and they were of all sorts. And even if you know a thing, you didn't know a thing, but that's the crew you wanted to be with, you could go do it, because we had enough builders in there, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, that knew all the stuff. And they would train kids. We had classes all day for the kids of different things. We had puppet ministries, we had drama ministries, we had sports ministries, everything you could think of that a kid would want to be able to do or feels like they could use. And but the training camp was the most amazing thing, because after 10 years, I had 10 volunteers that started. I couldn't get volunteers the first training camp. Couldn't get them. Nobody wanted to come. After they saw the kids, 10 of them walked up to me right after the church service when we returned and said, we want to be there next year. And I thought, okay, I'll take your names. But it's a whole year away, and a lot's going to happen, and we'll see. All 10 of them came. All 10 of them stayed with me for all the years. And I did it for 23 years. And so in doing that, our volunteer corps swelled. We had a kitchen crew, all the cooks, and I had actually literal chefs that would come, and cook for all the kids. And we didn't make the food that great, though, because where they were going, we didn't want it. So they could cook. They could make good out of what they had, right? So it was rough. But it was like a well-oiled machine. Everybody knew what they were doing. And at night, every night, we had a rally under a big top. And we had a band, and we had all kinds of stuff going on. And all the kids, whatever they were learning, they would do, right? So this team might do a puppet show. This team might do a drama show. This team might give testimony. This team has kids singing. This team has whatever. And they would come one after another, because I would organize all that. And they'd come, and one team after another, and the whole rally would go 2 hours. And at the end, before they were commissioned, it was a commissioning service, and all the parents would come up. So it swelled to about 600-700 people. And we had a tent that sat 1,000. So they would come up, and they would, just be a part of it. And the parents, it was fun to watch, because they'd be like, watching their kids. And then we get all these other parents say, can we volunteer for this? Could we go, And we couldn't take them all, right? Because we had just too many people. And we didn't let anybody do nothing when they came. You had to do something, or you wouldn't feel that you belong, right? So you would feel so out of place if you got there, because you're seeing people going everywhere. You don't even know what they're doing, and everybody's on a mission, and you would feel like, I got to get out of here, because I feel like I'm out of place. So pretty amazing. So I'm going to give you 2 examples in the Old Testament, Nehemiah. And when you look at Nehemiah is an amazing story. We'll do a preaching series on it sometime, but it's an amazing story. Nehemiah was born in Persia. He was a Jew, but he was born from the captivity over in Persia, or at least brought to Persia at some point, because Persia took over the Babylonian Empire. So they conquered them. Remember the Jews? They were conquered by the Babylonians. So all of a sudden, everybody became Persian, right? I mean, that was the governing. So God used King Artaxerxes, King Cyrus initially, and actually names him in Isaiah 44 and 45. Calls him out by name hundreds of years before he came on the scene. And he ends up being his cupbearer. So a cupbearer is someone, just in case you don't know, someone who would taste the king's food. They'd bring it out in front of the king. He would take portions of it, eat it, and then he would drink the king's wine. They'd have entertainment for 30 minutes, because all known poisons worked within 25 minutes. If he didn't die, the king would eat. That's how it worked. So you were on your last meal every day. You didn't know. And that was the most common way to kill him. So Nehemiah is there. He has access to the king. And somebody comes to them. And very briefly, he's not alone, but he's not near Israel. And he's working for the Persian king. So he's in the capital city of Susa. And he sees some of his brothers, Jews, come from Israel, right? The promised land. And he asks them right away, what's going on there? Oh, it's terrible. It's a deplorable state. The walls of the protection of the city, they're all falling down. They keep getting raided. All kinds of things happen. And it just overwhelmed him. He had such a heart for God that he broke down and he wept. And he wept, and it said for days. And then, in all of that, God comes to him. You can read the story. God comes to him, and he understands something. He said, I'm the cupbearer to the king. I have access to the king. So he puts everything on the line, and he goes and he says to the king, can I leave for a period of time? The ancestral home I come from is in terrible shape. I'd like to go there and rebuild it, blah, blah, blah. And the king said, how long will you be gone? So it doesn't say, but we can figure out. So he told the king how long he'd be gone, and the king said, okay, well, 12 years. So it's like, you're getting a 12-year leave. Who wouldn't take that from work, right? So he goes, and when he gets, and before he goes, the king says, what are you going to do? So he tells him what he's going to do. And he says, could the king give us the materials from the king's forest? So the king says, yes. Then could you do this? Yes. Not only that, but without asking, the king sent an army with him because he understood that there was problems and that, to protect them getting there, and, he would do it. So he does it. Does all the stuff. He comes down, he goes around the whole place, and know what he sees? Everything is a mess. Everything's dilapidated. Everything's broken down. Everything's got a problem. And so if we look, and I hope I put the right verse first. So take a look at 2:17 and 18. And again, we're only going to look at a couple of verses. So in 17, chapter 2, verse 17, it says, then I said to them, after he did his inspection, he said to them, the leaders of the Jews, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so we will no longer be in disgrace. Why in disgrace? So the temple was rebuilt by Haggai, right, in those days, by the people, but this is 75 years later, and so they can't bring people back to live because the only protection you have in a city are the walls. And the walls have to have gates. Because if you have no gates, you got no walls really. There's just holes in the wall. So they got everything done. So under Nehemiah's leadership, they end up coming back, and he doesn't share the plan here, but you pick up the plan as you're reading it. He breaks them all down, and this was brilliant. The Jews are in families who make up clans, who make up tribes. So he took those leaders of the clans, and he said to them, you're all going to take a section of the wall. Because nobody had been able to accomplish this. Zerubbabel returned 90 years earlier. Ezra came 70 years earlier. Nobody's been able to do it, and so everybody gave up. So he comes back and he says, we're all going to do it at once. And he gets everybody involved. Because before, not everybody got involved. It was just the people that were skilled, just gets them all involved. In 52 days, he builds the whole wall around the whole city, except for, there's no gaps, except for he didn't hang the gates yet. So he's going to do that. Then you see Satan working, using enemies, and a whole bunch of things happen, and they stand up for it every time. But what does he do? He uses all the people again. So one of the things that came down, we're going to use these verses on next Thursday, is he gathered the same people. They're all inside. He said, bring everybody in the city. Nobody wanted to stay in the city because if they got attacked, there's nowhere to leave, right? You're going to get closed in. So he said, we're all going to stay in the city. We're all going to carry weapons. We're all going to work, and half of you will stand guard while the other half works. Everyone will carry a weapon. And they'll have shofar horns all the way around the city. And if you hear a shofar horn go, you drop what you're doing, and everybody run weapon in hand, because that's where the battle is. And so because they did that, there was no battle. And the enemy understood what they were doing. So it worked out that way. So everybody come together, amazing stuff. Okay? Anybody trying to do it alone, didn't work out. That's an incredible picture all the way through Nehemiah. So I want to encourage you to read that. That was, people getting together, people being incentivized, people, believing in the leadership and saying, we can make a difference if we do that. And that's what will happen, okay? There's other places in Exodus you find stuff where Moses says to the Israelites that we're going to build the tabernacle. He's got the pattern. Everybody looked at this. Nobody could do that. But there were two men that says, it's the only place in the Old Testament I think it says this, Bezalel and Aholiab, that the Holy Spirit came upon them to empower them. They were good craftsmen already. Aholiab was the assistant to Bezalel. So when they were empowered by the Holy Spirit, then Moses said, now all of you who are artisans of some sort, okay, workers, go to them. They're going to put you to work and they're going to do it. Everybody else, donate, because they brought a lot of stuff out of Egypt, right? Remember all the things they had, the jewelries and all that. So he said, every one of you, but he said, it's got to be willing. I'm not mandating it. You have to do it as a willing offering to do it. And they did. And at one point, Moses had to put the word out because the workers came to him and said to Moses, we have too much. Too much. I've never heard a church say that. We've got too much. Never heard them say it. Now, I'm not bashing the churches. They don't say it because they say, well, if God gave us this, there's a reason. So they'll use it. But it's never, you always have enough because you have what God gives you. But you never have enough if you're trying to do more, out there. So it's a kind of a good balance to have. So we see this, and this goes on under Moses, right? So a lot of background, a lot of context there, and you can see those things. Nehemiah, when he's doing it, he appeals to the people, he gets the people excited. They start seeing, and one of the things that he did to get them excited, and it's in one of these verses here, but I'm going to go a little faster. Might be in 2:17 and 18. He gives his testimony. Really amazing thing. What was his testimony? He tells them how the hand of the Lord was upon him in Susa at the citadel with the king. How the king provided all the stuff he needed. And even without asking, he sent an army. And the people got so excited, they joined in the work and said, this is a work of God. Because they saw God's hand. That's why testimony is so important. People come to church at times and they start feeling, you know what? I must be the only one that doesn't see God work. Or I'm not sure God works that way anymore because you don't hear people saying it. We need to say that more. And even in the little things, right? I can share tons of things, and I will share some, but everybody else has to share some, right? Of what God is doing. And you guys did some of that today. So that was, and that was great. So all this is going on. Nehemiah works through. They get there. They build the whole city, and it becomes a city again. And it's an amazing thing that goes on. Then you get over to the New Testament, and you have 1 Corinthians chapter 12. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul goes to Corinth, and they're abusing the gifts. They're called grace gifts. That's my sermon today, called grace gifts. Why? Because, did you ever hear charismatic? Charismatic, some people say, oh, isn't that a kind of a church? Well, sometimes you might call that Pentecostal. Sometimes you call it charismatic. The difference between the two is that Pentecostal is an actual denomination. They have groups of people. Charismatic is usually used to refer of the Spirit of God's move in an established mainline church. But the word charisma comes from the Greek, and it means grace. And it's all the gifts in the New Testament are grace gifts, given by the grace of God. Why are gifts given? They're given to be used. They're not given to be held on to. We use the gifts. Those gifts, you'll find a list of gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. You'll find another list in Ephesians 4. You'll find another list in Romans 11, I think. And you'll find all these gifts. It's not exhaustive. There are more gifts than the Bible mentions, right? And God empowers when we need them. Okay, that's what he does. But he'll only do it if you're willing to use them. If you're not willing to use them, what do they say in the athletic world? You don't use it, you lose it. Right? If you're not constantly doing it, you lose what you had. Okay? And that's with anything, not just the athletic world. So in Ephesians, right, or in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the body. He goes to Corinth and he says, you're elevating this gift of tongues. So Paul, every list Paul makes, that's the last gift he mentions. Not because it's worse than any. Paul says he spoke in tongues. But it's not it. It's that you've got it all out of balance. It's not, you're not going there. That's not the mark of a Christian. It's not the mark because you can speak in another language, that you didn't learn, or it's a spiritual language. That's not the quality. That's not what it is. Not everybody gets it. And that's why Paul says, is everybody an arm? Is everybody a mouth? Is everybody a nose? Is everybody an ear? No. If everybody were, where would the body be? But God puts people into a body with different abilities. So that those abilities can be empowered by God or new abilities given, right? So in Bezalel and Aholiab, they were already craftsmen, but they didn't have the ability to do what God was calling them to do. So he empowered what they had and made it greater and more. So he'll do that with our natural talents, but he'll also give gifts that we don't have because somebody may not have them in the body. Somebody needs to have them because God needs to use it. You'll get it, right? Several might get it. That's what he does. And I've seen that many times through the years. So those are a couple of good examples. And then finally, we'll just talk about Ephesians 4 and especially 11 to 13. Here's what it says. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service. Were they there to do the work? The prophets, the teachers, the evangelists, the pastors, the apostles? No. They were there to equip the church. Now, by equipping, they still did it, but they were equipping. Why? Because God's church is built to grow. That's what it's built. That's the DNA. You get a baby and it's born, and the baby's not growing the way it should, that's the first thing a doctor's going to say, baby's not growing the way it should, let's get him in here and check this out, right? If a baby doesn't grow, you know something's wrong. If a church doesn't grow, not that growth is everything, but if it doesn't grow, and it can grow in spurts, it can grow, over time, and there's more than just numbers that make the growth. There's growing internally. There's growing, God needs to grow us at times to get us to a place to be able to take the next step, right? So there's all different things, and I've seen all of the above throughout my years. So you'll see that. So Christ himself gave those positions to the church, and he names 5 of them. And he says, and that they're to equip the body of Christ that they may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. You know what God intends for his church? Every one of you become mature. What's mature? You can walk a walk of faith. You know your scriptures. You pray. You have a prayer life. You have a study life where you're doing that. You understand, giving. You understand of yourself, giving, and willingly giving yourself to God to do those things, right? So you get a right understanding of what the church is, should be, and then say, how can I be a part of that? That's what we try to do. So that's the picture. And when Paul, does this, he calls believers to live in a manner worthy of their calling, right? And by being humble, gentle, patient, and bearing with one another in love. Why does he say that? Because he knows the church also has sin. Meaning, we're sinners. We're not always going to do it right. We're not always going to be right. Somebody can be in a bad mood one day. You happen to run into them. It wasn't a good meeting. But we have to bear with one another. And instead of getting angry, first thing we say is, I'm going to call them maybe tomorrow. See how they're doing. Right? Not going to get offended. Something obviously is going wrong. This is what Paul means by bearing with. Right? We have those issues. So a lot of stuff like that that goes on. And so Paul talks all about equipping, all for the larger context of the church growing. And he's the one that I'll say beats up on the Corinthians because they had more problems in that church, but thank God for us because we got to see Paul correct the church, and we learn an awful lot about the early church from that one church, right? On what was going on, what was wrong, and what should have been going on that was right. So those are things that we learn. So the Bible is just full of examples, beginning to end, of the church operating together. God's people coming together. He empowers the church with His Spirit. By the church growing together and becoming one. And I'll tell you, this is the story I'll end with, and I've told it to you already, so I'm not going to labor it. What changed me more than anything else, God was at work. There was and I saw in hindsight, oh my goodness, and I could name today, I could tell you exactly what He did, right? But when it was happening, I couldn't. And when I ended up in that little church, the people that said hello to me that were kind, the adults, it was like, these aren't real. I didn't think these were real people. Like something's like going on here. It's like a little strange, because they can't be real. Because I don't know anybody who does this. It's like this. So I'm thinking maybe they just do that on Sundays. Maybe they just, And then when you got to know them after a couple months, I'm saying, no, this is really them. This is who they are. This is what they do. They still, had issues. They still had family issues. They still struggled. They still got upset. But they did it differently than anybody I had seen up to that point. And so it was amazing. And that's what God calls us to. That is the difference. He said, they will know that you, what? Are my disciples by your love for one another. Right? That's the picture. So in summary of this stuff, because we're going to go into another part, and I want to have another 2-minute conversation here. The Bible is full of examples of God, showing us that His people have always been called to work together to accomplish His plan. You can see it all the way through the Bible, beginning to the very end. Whether it's rebuilding cities like Nehemiah was doing, right? Or caring for one another or advancing the message of the gospel, the principle of unity and collaboration runs through Old and New Testament. Clearly, it does. And, from building the tabernacle, which was erected rapidly, right? The gifts came in, the workers worked, everything worked like a well-oiled machine. I'm sure they had their issues, but it was all moving to accomplish what God called them to do. And in the same way, believers today are called to cooperate with each other and with God to accomplish His will on the earth. God's will is not material. It's not us owning things, buying things, having toys, all the things. We might have some of those things, right? Probably all either have a house, rent a house, or live in a house, an apartment, something, right? So it's there. You need it. But if that's the be-all, end-all, you got to see the house I just got. You got to see the car I drive. You got to see. You start thinking that way, you can know that you're on the outer edge now. Because that's not what it's for. God could call you at any time and say, I want you to use that for this. Sell this. Go here. Do that. But if you're not listening, you won't hear Him. It just won't happen. And you'll carry on, and you're not going to be in the will of God in those ways, right? Because God can't use us if we're not listening. That's the big picture. So, and He didn't call us to amass wealth. That's an American thing. Totally an American thing. It's not even in a lot of countries I've been to. It's not what they try to do, right? And it's funny because any of the countries I've been to that are desperately poor, you give kids a handful of candy, they go share it with their friends. If there's 5 and they've got 4 other friends, that's what they're doing. And you're thinking, that's an amazing quality. Now that's as much a kid quality as it is, a third world. But they don't have it, so they can't focus on it. And they don't. The more we get, the more we focus on it. Why does God say give some of your money away? Because we focus on it, and we're intended to see how hard is it to part with it. Then you know if you're in trouble or not, right? So those are the pictures. And what we want to do today is talk about that because, we're down a handful of people today, but that's okay. We're going to do it anyway. And, we want to get people involved in the body. Because if we're not, the load falls on a few. If it can fall on many and we can exercise the gifts that God gave us, then it's fantastic, right? And even if you don't have a gift for what you're looking at, you might say, that'd be interesting, I'd like to learn that. And that's okay too.